This was never just a marriage of convenience, it was a kingdom built on violence, suddenly confronted by its deepest weakness, the absence of legacy. Conrad believed he was choosing a woman to preserve his power, but what he was really doing was inviting in the one person capable of exposing the emptiness beneath it. In a world obsessed with bloodlines, dominance, and masculine control, the woman everyone dismissed as broken became the emotional and moral center of a dying empire.
In Chicago's underworld, power is not counted in soldiers or graves. It is measured in bloodline, in the scion who inherits the empire after the war that always comes. Without an heir, a king is merely a placeholder, a man ruling on borrowed time. Conrad Valetti learned this lesson 3 years ago, when his doctor gave him a verdict that shook the Midwest's most powerful crime family. A poison from a rival's truce had done more than endanger his life. It had stolen his future. The diagnosis was absolute sterility, a genetic dead end. He commanded a billion-dollar portfolio of legitimate and illicit trades, yet was now a biological conclusion. In his world, sterile is a deadlier word than bullet, a vulnerability the wolves could smell on the wind. Whispers started in shielded rooms and private clubs. Conrad Valetti's reign had an expiration date, and every ambitious underling began to calculate the void. But biology is irrelevant to destiny, and fate in Chicago has a cruel sense of humor. Enter Reese Calloway, 27, surviving on back-to-back shifts and cheap coffee at Serafina, a restaurant secretly owned by Conrad's organization. She was no one's idea of a queen. She was drowning under $280,000 in medical bills left by her late mother. Her shoes were worn thin as leaves, and she endured nightly abuse from customers who saw her as furniture that could walk. Her ex-boyfriend, an investment banker named Grant Hartwell, broke it off when he saw her debt, calling her damaged goods before vanishing. By any sane measure, Reese Calloway's life was a quiet, steady erosion, one more soul consumed by a heartless city. But one factor was not considered. The night Conrad Valetti walked into Serafina, he saw no damage. He saw steel holding its form under fire, absorbing every blow without a tremor, a posture that was her final, unbreakable possession. He had no use for a porcelain doll that would shatter under pressure. He required a survivor, someone who had already faced the worst and was still standing. This is the unwritten history of a syndicate boss declared obsolete and the destitute waitress who rewrote his fate. It is a story of power, betrayal, a strange connection, and a biological miracle that reshaped the future of Chicago's most feared criminal enterprise. If this brief is of interest, approve its contents, forward to your network, and subscribe for future installments. We now go back to Chicago's cold streets to the moment Conrad Valetti entered Serafina and first saw the woman who would change everything. Conrad Valetti claimed the VIP table in Serafina's deepest shadow, where light was a commodity and a brick wall offered a bulwark from the dining floor. His 2 bodyguards stood near the entrance, close enough to act but too far to hear their principal speak. He ignored the menu. The restaurant was a family holding buried in a Delaware LLC under 3 corporate veils. His storm gray eyes were locked on the waitress who, fresh from a verbal lashing by a table of socialites, set down their plates with hands that did not betray a single shake. Reese came to the VIP table with a small notepad, her back a rigid line. Though a faint flush colored her eyes, her voice was perfectly level. "Good evening. What can I bring you?" Conrad ignored the question. He tilted his head, pinning her with a look that made hardened men in Chicago glance away and ask something that wasn't on the menu. "You were handling table 7, Conrad said, his voice a low, deliberate thing. It was a statement, not a question. Table 7 belonged to Vera Ashton and her friends. Reese's fingers tightened on her notepad. her knuckles showing white. She knew who he was. Every employee at Serafina did. They were told on day one, if Conrad Valetti comes in, serve him fast, serve him silently, and never hold his gaze for more than 3 seconds. Reese met his eyes and didn't count. Yes, sir, I was. And if you're asking if I cried, the answer is no. I don't have time for that. My shift ends at 11, and I have 14 more tables before the kitchen staff leaves. So what will you have? Or should I get you a different server? A pocket of absolute silence opened between them. In that beat, Conrad Valetti didn't see a waitress pretending to be tough. He saw the very thing he'd been searching for 3 years without even knowing it. Someone who wasn't afraid of him. Not out of stupidity or recklessness, but because her life had already thrown far worse things at her than a crime lord in a dark restaurant. A double espresso, Conrad said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not a smile, but a silent acknowledgement that a woman in worn-out shoes had just challenged him and hadn't blinked. Reese nodded, turned, and walked away. She didn't know his gray-blue eyes followed her to the bar, followed her as she prepared a tray, and followed her as she stood alone in a kitchen corner, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. Her hand shook for exactly 3 seconds before she inhaled deeply and went back to work. 3 seconds was all the weakness she permitted herself. Conrad saw all 3, and he saw her recover. He left Serafina at 10:45 that evening, leaving no tip but placing 3 folded $100 bills under his cup. Inside his car, he took out his phone and dialed his one trusted non-family operative. I want a full workup, he said, his voice flat with the calm of command. Reese Calloway, waitress at Serafina, age 27. I want her debts, her home, her school records, her sheet, and every known associate. I want it on my desk by 7 a.m. tomorrow. By 3 in the morning, the file was on Conrad's desk in his Lincoln Park home. He didn't sleep, sitting in the dark of his study with one lamp on, analyzing each page as if it were a multi-million-dollar deal. Reese Calloway, born in Rockford, Illinois. Father died when she was 11, a workplace accident with no payout. Her mother raised her, working 2 jobs for 13 years until a diagnosis of stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Reese had been a sophomore studying finance at DePaul University when she dropped out to care for her. Her mother passed 2 years ago, bequeathing a debt of $280,000, for which Reese was the co-signer. The file revealed no priors, no significant contacts, and no allegiances. The final assessment: she was utterly and completely alone. Conrad shut the folder. He sat in the darkness, a finger tapping a slow beat on the mahogany desk, a metronome counting down. The pieces were fitting together with the cold precision of a grandmaster. The subject is clean, resilient, unattached, and shows no fear of me. At 6 in the morning, as a gray Chicago mist rolled off Lake Michigan, Conrad Valetti was dressed, and in his car, his driver directed to Serafina. He had an offer to make, and he was not the kind of man to make it twice. At 6:15 a.m., Serafina was stripped of its glamour. The candlelight, clinking glasses, and expensive scents were gone. There was only the chemical tang of disinfectant, the hard glare of overhead lights, and Reese Calloway alone, wiping down tables with a rag worn nearly to thread. She came in 45 minutes early every day for an extra $50 a week. $50 that decided if she ate once or twice a day. She heard the back door click open before she saw anyone. The sound was wrong. The kitchen crew never arrived before 7. The manager's schedule put his arrival after 8. Besides the staff, Only the owner had a key to that door, and Serafina's true owner was a man who, by his nature, never used a main entrance. Conrad Valetti appeared at the kitchen hallway without an escort. A black coat hung to his knees over an unbuttoned white shirt, revealing his collarbone and the faded line of a scar on his shoulder. He looked like he had just woken up and hadn't slept for days. His gray-blue eyes held the same cold, cutting focus Reese had seen the night before. Reese stayed perfectly still, a damp cloth in her hand, showing no instinct for flight. "We are not open for business," she said, her voice completely flat. "Espresso is the only option, and it demands a 20-minute preheat. The kitchen is otherwise shut down." Conrad ignored the offered chair, holding his position 3 paces from her. His hands were buried in his pockets, his intense gaze broadcasting the weight of his purpose. "I didn't come for coffee, Miss Calloway. I have a proposal, and I see no point in beating around the bush." Ree laid the cleaning cloth on a counter with immense care, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm listening." Conrad started his explanation with the measured rhythm of a man used to giving orders. He spoke with brutal efficiency, each word essential. "A consortium of the most powerful families in Chicago and the Midwest existed," he explained, "and it was being co-opted by a Russian named Anton Jerkov, a man driven by relentless ambition. Conrad's only weakness, the one Jerkov exploited, was his lack of an heir. A 12-month ultimatum had been issued. If he could not produce a successor in that time, a vote would strip him of his power, and his entire empire would be methodically disassembled. "I need a wife," Conrad said plainly. "This has nothing to do with love or romance. I need a partner strong enough to stand against my enemies and clever enough not to be destroyed by them. It would be a marriage in name only. You'd live in my home, acting as my wife for the benefit of the council. In return, I will erase your $280,000 debt completely. No more collection calls, no more escalating interest, no more of the mental exhaustion." For 10 seconds, Ree was silent, a pause more profound than any bargaining tactic Conrad had ever witnessed. When she spoke, her voice was even, her words chosen with precision. "You are the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld. You could have your pick of anyone. Why me?" For a waitress drowning in debt, his answer was swift. "Because last night, I watched you withstand a 20-minute campaign of verbal abuse without once showing a sign of cracking. Any woman who can endure that kind of mental strain and remain unshaken has a strength that can't be bought. But there is something else I have to tell you. Without this knowledge, your agreement would be invalid." He stopped, his jaw clenching so tightly a flicker of movement agitated the scar. It was a secret he had not shared with an outsider in 3 years. "I cannot have children. My enemies poisoned me 3 years ago, leaving me permanently sterile. The doctors confirmed it. You would be marrying a man who represents the end of his line. You need to know this before you answer." Ree watched him for a long moment. There was no pity in her look, no trace of fear. Instead, there was the acknowledgement of one person branded broken by the world seeing another marked by the same stigma. "And if I agree," Ree said carefully, "I become a part of your world." "You know what that world is?" Conrad confirmed, nodding once. "I can't promise you safety. That would be a lie. What I can promise is respect, and I can guarantee that in my world, no one will ever call you damaged. That is more than anyone else has ever offered you." Ree started to speak, but her attention was suddenly pulled away to something outside Serafina's front window. Through the glass, under the fall Chicago sun, Grant Hartwell walked by with his new wife. She was young, blonde, and wrapped in cashmere, a large diamond on her finger and the gentle swell of early pregnancy visible. Grant wore the easy smile of a man free from crippling debt, the kind that came with a $280,000 bill for a loved one's care. He strode past the cafe, never looking in. His indifference was the final confirmation that Ree Calloway no longer existed in his life. Ree turned her gaze back to Conrad. Her eyes were dry, her jaw was tight, and her voice was the icy calm of someone who had seen the bleak future of refusal and chosen to walk into a battlefield rather than fade into nothing. "When do we start?" she asked. Conrad watched her for one last beat, confirming his judgment. He had made the right choice. 2:00 this afternoon, Chicago City Hall. A car will pick you up at 1. You'll need your ID, nothing else. He turned for the back door, stopping at the threshold of the kitchen. "And Miss Calloway," he added without looking back, "that $300 last night wasn't a tip. It was your final paycheck." Then he was gone. Ree stood alone in the empty cafe, her knuckles white as she gripped an oak table, her breathing fast and heavy. She did not weep. No smile touched her lips. For a precise count of 3 seconds, she was a statue, then her hands unclenched. She carefully folded the rag and set it on the counter, untied her apron, placed it on its hook, and walked out of Serafina forever. The wedding began at 2 in the afternoon at City Hall on the 5th floor in room 12, a cramped office that smelled of old files and floor polish. There were no flowers, no guests, only 2 other men. Judge Raymond Kessler was one, a film of sweat on his brow, revealing his nervousness around the man to whom he owed a great deal. The other was Felix Valetti, Conrad's 28-year-old brother, who leaned against a wall with his arms crossed, his face as cold and hard as a frozen lake. As planned, a black car sent by Conrad retrieved Ree from her run-down South Side apartment at 1 in the afternoon. She wore the only dress she owned that wasn't a uniform. A faded gray thing she'd bought for $12 from a thrift shop 3 years ago. Her shoes were the same worn black flats from the last 2 years. She hadn't bothered with her appearance. It didn't matter. This wasn't a marriage. It was a business deal. Ree Calloway was used to signing contracts for predatory loans, for leases she knew she'd break, for debts she couldn't pay. This was just one more line to sign. The whole thing took less than 7 minutes. The judge's voice shook as he read the vows, his eyes darting to Conrad as if for permission to breathe. When his turn came, Conrad said, "I do," with the flat, impersonal tone of a man closing a real estate transaction. Ree repeated the words, her own voice just as empty of emotion but firm and clear. She signed the register with a steady hand, set down the pen, and didn't look back at her name. Felix said nothing the entire time, but his gaze never left Ree. His eyes were the same gray as his brother's, but sharper, filled with a potent mix of contempt and suspicion. He watched her like a chess master, analyzing a surprising move. A car took them straight to the Valetti mansion in Lincoln Park. Ree had no luggage with her. She owned nothing worth carrying. Her entire former life fit into one cloth suitcase, which had been collected by Conrad's men 2 hours earlier, the way a crime scene is wiped clean. The house was a 3-story limestone mansion from the 1920s on a hushed street near the lake. From the outside, it looked like a museum, imposing and lifeless. That feeling continued inside. A vaulted ceiling and a crystal chandelier dominated the main hall, but the air was still and cold like an abandoned church. The marble floors shone like a mirror, unmarked by a single footprint, stray shoe or jacket thrown aside. It was a monument to wealth, a place for existing, not living. The first person she met was Margaret Byrne, the 55-year-old housekeeper, whose face was severe but whose eyes were kind. She took Ree's hand between both of hers and whispered, "Welcome home," with an unsettling sincerity that Ree knew was real. Paige Valetti was the first of the 4 younger family members to emerge. She was 24, dark-haired like the others, and wore pearls with a simple house dress, an odd mix of formality and deep-seated weariness. Ree saw it in Paige instantly, a look she knew with chilling intimacy, having seen it on her own face in the mirror every day for the 2 years she cared for her mother at the end of her life. It was the expression of a person carrying a burden too heavy for their years, a silent cry for rescue. "Hello," Paige said, the word polite but laced with a faint, constant tremble, betraying 1,000 things left unsaid. Tommy wasn't there. "Tommy's in the art room," Conrad said, gesturing to the 3rd floor. "He's extremely withdrawn." Ree filed the fact away. Then the 16-year-old twins, Nina and Noah, children of a brother who'd been killed 5 years ago, appeared from a game room, moving like wolves, sizing up new prey that had wandered into their den. Na's eyes raked over Ree, her voice pitched for the entire room to hear. "Interesting shoes! Did you get those at the $1 store?" A snort of laughter came from Noah at her side. Ree's gaze fell to her own worn feet, then rose to meet Na's. Her voice was level, empty of hurt or anger. "I did, and they've been more useful than any $1,000 pair you own." Na was momentarily speechless, her sneer faltering. It was then that Ree saw, for the first time, the slightest tilt of Conrad's head, the ghost of a smile he concealed. That night, after Conrad had vanished into his 1st-floor study and a deep quiet settled over the house, Ree was walking toward her room on the 2nd floor when a figure stepped out of the stairwell, blocking her path. It was Felix Valetti, leaning against the wall, hands buried in his pockets. The hallway light cut across his face, carving him from the shadows. He said nothing, his gaze a cold, steady weight, letting the silence press in on her. In this house, Ree knew, silence was a weapon. "Listen to me," Felix finally said, his voice a low, deliberate threat. "I don't care what my brother thinks he sees in you. It means nothing. I've watched dozens come into this house." He paused. "Every one of them left. You're a contract, a signature on a page. Don't ever think that makes you family." Ree did not back away, though he was taller by a head and carried the coiled stillness of a man who solved problems with violence. She held his gaze, and when she finally spoke, her voice was perfectly still. Not defiant, just barren. It was the unnerving calm of someone who had been called damaged so many times the word had lost its sting. "I'm not confused about anything, Felix. I know my role here. I signed a paper and I finish what I start. You can hate me, you can watch me, you can put me through any test you want, but I will be here tomorrow. And the day after that." She moved past him, her shoulder nearly brushing his, and went straight into her room. She locked the door, leaned her back against the cool oak, and only then did a tremor begin in her hands. But there were no tears. She had run out of tears long before she came to this place. The morning after the confrontation with Felix, Ree awoke at 5 a.m. in a bedroom larger than her entire old apartment, stared at the high ceiling for 30 seconds, then rose to begin the only thing she knew how to do. When confronted with chaos, she built order. This wasn't about cleaning. The Validi estate had Margaret Byrne, and 2 staff for that. Ree's purpose was more fundamental. She began to remake the broken rhythm of the house itself. On the second day, she went to the kitchen at 6 a.m. and found the industrial refrigerator full of catered meal boxes. Each had a label: Conrad, Felix, Paige, Tommy, Nina, Noah. Every person had a separate menu. They all ate alone, in different rooms, at different times. 6 people sharing a roof, but never a table. Reopened the trash can and one by one, methodically threw every single meal away. From the doorway, Margaret Byrne watched in silence. And for the first time, in a long, long while, the corner of her mouth turned up in a faint smile. During that first week, while clearing old glass jars from the pantry, a crate fell and shattered on the stone floor. A sharp piece of glass sliced a deep gash into the arch of her left foot. But Ree, long practiced in swallowing pain, just cleaned the wound, wrapped it in a makeshift bandage, and said nothing to anyone. That evening, she cooked dinner. It wasn't a complex Italian recipe or anything from a restaurant. She made a meal her mother used to make on Sundays back in Rockford. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, simple gravy. It was the kind of food whose smell fills a home, an unspoken invitation to come together. She set the long table in the main dining room. It was the first time in the 4 years since the Valetti matriarch had been shot and killed that the table was laid for more than one person. She didn't call anyone to eat. She just cooked, set the places, and sat down. Paige was the first to appear. She stood in the doorway for almost 2 minutes, just looking at the table and at Ree sitting there alone, before she walked in and took a seat without a word. Nat and Noah came down for food, not for family, but they came. They sat. They ate. And for the first time in years, the room echoed with the small sound of multiple forks and knives on plates. Tommy did not come down. Conrad did not come down. Felix walked past the dining room entrance, his gaze flicking over the scene before he continued on without a word. But Ree noticed his stride falter for precisely 2 beats before he was gone. On third day, the 4th and the 5th, Ree cooked the same way, set the same table, and sat in the same chair. She never forced anyone. She just created a pocket of warmth and consistency and waited to see who would step into it. Paige stepped in first and the furthest. By the 4th day, she was no longer just showing up to eat. She was coming to the kitchen early, standing beside Ree with her hands clasped, asking in a voice so quiet it seemed braced for rejection, "Can you show me how to make this sauce?" Ree passed the wooden spoon to her with few words, just, "Watch, stir slow, keep it steady." And in the warm silence of the kitchen, fragrant with butter, garlic, and basil, Paige began to talk. Not about big things, but about small, broken shards, fragments of the life she'd known before the last 4 years. My mother used to love cooking. I missed the way the kitchen smelled back then. It's been dead since she died. Ree didn't hug her or offer cheap comforts. She just stood beside her, working and listened. She knew some people don't need words. They just need a quiet, steady presence to witness their pain. Tommy was the house's deepest mystery. At 19, he moved like a ghost, rarely spoke, and never seemed to leave the 3rd-floor art room. Ree didn't knock on his door. She didn't ask him to join them. She just left a plate of hot food on a tray from Margaret Byrne outside his door every night, a folded napkin beside it. On the 5th morning, the tray was empty. On the 7th day, she found something waiting at her seat at the dining table, a small hand-sized pencil sketch of a wildflower growing through a crack in the sidewalk. There was no name, no note, but Ree knew the artist. She picked up the little drawing, studied it for a long time, then carefully folded it and put it in her pocket where it stayed all day. On the 9th day, there was a second drawing, a sparrow on a windowsill. On the 12th, a sunset over Lake Michigan. Tommy still hadn't spoken a single word to her, but he was communicating in his own language and reheard every transmission perfectly. Na and Noah were a far simpler challenge. Ree never argued, scolded, or lectured. She met every one of their provocations with a placid humor their teenage cruelty couldn't penetrate. When Noah stole her only pair of shoes and she heard him giggling from hiding, Ree just walked into the kitchen barefoot and started to cook. The lack of a reaction unnerved him so much he returned the shoes before dinner. A prank with no audience offered no reward. When Na sneered, "Why are your clothes so cheap? You're married to the head of the family," Ree replied. "Fine clothes can't roast a chicken," and slid the crispiest piece onto Na's plate. The girl ate every bite, her anger momentarily silenced by a more basic need. Felix was a different kind of animal. Felix was not a child. He was a 28-year-old man who had seen his brother nearly die 3 years before, and who had sworn no outsider would ever get close enough to hurt them again. He did not hide Ree's shoes. Shoes. He was playing a much deadlier game. A deep background check on her was already in motion, run through his own untraceable network. He queried Margaret Byrne daily for any sign of Ree snooping in Conrad's study, any hidden calls, or meetings with strangers. His arrival at dinner on the 6th day wasn't a truce. It was a move to observe her up close. Throughout the meal, he watched her with a wolf's unblinking intensity, probing for any fissure in her composure. Reese felt his gaze. She knew Felix was waiting for one slip, a single misplaced question, a flicker of greed. Fear was not part of the equation. Her only secret was the growing stack of Tommy's drawings hidden in her pocket. During the 3rd week, Conrad flew to Boston to negotiate terms with an East Coast syndicate, a power play he could not delegate. To be absent from his chair would be seen as a retreat, a sign to his rivals that Conrad Valley was weakening. 3 days, he told Felix before the car left for O'Hare. 3 days. Lock down the grounds, isolate the family, no one in or out until I'm back. Felix nodded his understanding. Conrad's eyes then found Ree in the kitchen doorway, his gaze holding for 2 heartbeats longer than usual. He got in the car without a word of parting. In his world, goodbyes were a weakness for men who didn't live with the constant chance of not returning. The first day passed in a deceptive quiet. Reese cooked. Paige helped in the kitchen. Na and Noah argued over the television before eating together. At the table, Tommy left another drawing for Reese, a cat sleeping in a sunbeam. Every 2 hours, Felix walked his security patrols, checking cameras, gates, and locks, his eyes conducting a cold, methodical scan of Ree each time he passed. On the 2nd night, that fragile peace broke. At 23:43, Ree sat at the kitchen table, a solitary figure under the house's only light, poring over an old ledger from the south side, a ritual to calm her mind. The children were all in bed. Felix was on the 1st floor, in the room beside Conrad's study, sleeping with a pistol under his pillow, the only way he knew how to rest. The first thing Ree noticed was the sound, or the lack of it. The silence was wrong. Not an absence of noise, but a deadened quality, as if the air itself was being muffled. Her eyes darted from the ledger to the security monitor. The camera at the main gate was on a loop. It wasn't a glitch. A lost signal would be a blue screen. This was a ghost image playing on repeat. The same branch swaying, the same guard frozen in time. Someone had breached the system and was feeding them a recording. Reese choked back the urge to scream. She didn't run. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands moved on pure instinct, a step ahead of her thoughts. She killed the kitchen light, grabbed her phone, and dialed Felix. He answered in less than a second. Her voice was a low, controlled whisper. "The gate feed is a loop. We're compromised. Get upstairs now." Felix asked no questions. He knew in this life that after the system fails, the next 30 seconds decide who lives and who dies. The sound of his boots pounding the oak stairs was like thunder as Reese slipped out of the kitchen and into the main hall. A shock wave of shattering glass ripped through the house. The sitting room door, the one facing the garden, had been blown inward. The explosion was sharp and professional, not a rock through a window, but a clean breach from a tool in an expert's hand. Reese and Felix met at the foot of the stairs. In the dim hall light, she saw the gun in his hand and saw his eyes, no longer watching her, but scanning for a threat. "How many?" Felix asked, his voice steady but his jaw tight. "No idea. All cameras are blind. No word from the gate. Could be 3, could be a dozen." Light bloomed from the back garden. The crunch of heavy boots on broken glass announced the perimeter was gone. They were inside. Reese spun, her eyes fixed on the top of the stairs. "Paige," she called, her voice pitched to carry upstairs but not across the ground floor. "Safe room, get the twins, now, don't bring anything, go." From above, she heard the frantic sounds of movement, a door opening, Na's sleepy question, "What's happening?" and Paige's sharp hiss, "Be quiet, just come with me." The safe room, a steel-lined bunker built by Conrad, was down the hall, locked from the inside, with enough oxygen for 6 people for 12 hours. Reese heard the bolt of the steel door slide home. 3 children were safe, but 2 were still out in the open. Tommy. The name hit Reese like a physical blow. He was on the 3rd floor in his art studio. The 19-year-old slept with headphones on to block out the nightmares of the night his mother died. He hadn't heard a thing. He was alone. Reese met Felix's eyes. In that shared look, all their animosity vanished. They were just 2 people doing a head count and coming up 1 short. "Tommy's on 3, she said. Felix started for the stairs. "I've got him." "No." Reese grabbed his arm, her voice so sharp it froze him in place. "Your job is to hold this stairway. If they get to the 2nd floor, that lock is all that stands between them and the kids. You have the only gun. You hold this ground. Nothing gets past. I'll get Tommy." Felix stared at her, and for the first time since he'd called her nothing but a name on a contract, his face showed something other than contempt. It looked like fear. "Are you insane?" Felix growled, his voice a low rumble. "They're armed." "So what are you? You have nothing to lose." "I have Tommy," she countered. Her voice was no longer a waitress's or a wife's. It was something older, a primal instinct more powerful than any weapon, the sound of someone willing to die for their own. "Hold the stairs, Felix." She turned and walked toward the darkness of the 3rd floor, unarmed, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards as her heart beat a violent rhythm. Below, she heard Felix swear, then the clean metallic click of him chambering around and aiming his weapon at the bottom of the stairs, where shadows and the sound of footsteps were starting to crawl up. The 3rd floor was pitch black. They had cut the power from outside when they hacked the cameras, turning the hall into a void broken only by a sliver of moonlight from a far window. Reese moved forward, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up from an old injury in her foot with every step. She considered her bare feet an advantage for silence, but the truth was the swelling from a hidden fever had made shoes impossible for days. Tommy's studio was at the far end of the hall, its door slightly open, revealing only darkness. Reese slipped inside, letting her eyes adjust for a long second, and then she saw him. He was coiled in a corner of the room, wedged between an easel and stacked canvases. He was clutching his sketchbook to his chest like a shield, his knees pulled up tight, his eyes seeing a horror 1,000 miles away. Reese knew that vacant stare. She'd seen it on her mother in the last weeks when pain had pushed her mind to a place no one could reach. Tommy wasn't in the room anymore. He was lost in a memory from 4 years ago. The night he watched his mother get shot 3 times in the sitting room right downstairs. He was only 15. Tonight's explosion had thrown him back into that terror. He was paralyzed. Tommy. Reese knelt, making herself small. Her voice was a soft whisper, even as her own heart threatened to break through her ribs. Tommy, it's Reese. You have to get up for me now. Can you hear me? Her words met only silence. His eyes looked straight through her, as if she were made of glass. He clutched the sketchbook so tightly his knuckles shone white. A tremor shook his frame, born not of cold, but of a memory that no drug could silence. Then steps on the 3rd floor landing, slow, heavy, and deliberate. Not Felix. Felix was holding the 2nd floor. Ree had heard 2 pops from a gun, the sound of a fight. That meant one intruder was downstairs, and this new one had found another way up. The East Service stairs, she guessed. The ones she had found during her first week. The footsteps stopped just beyond the art room door. Ree got to her feet, turning from Tommy to face it. Her hand swept across the table, past a stack of canvases, and closed around the first thing it found. A stainless steel palette knife, not even 6 inches long, that Tommy used for his art. It felt like nothing in her hand. A tool for opening mail, not a weapon. But it was all she had. For 27 years, Reese Calloway had made do with only what was available, and she had never been broken. The door crashed open. A large man dressed in black stood there, his face masked, a silenced pistol in his hand. His eyes darted around, found Tommy, the objective, and then locked on Ree, standing in his way. He tilted his head, a flash of confusion at the sight of a woman in pajamas holding a paper knife, blocking his path instead of running. Ree did not run. She stood her ground, barefoot on the cold floor, the useless knife in her right hand. She met the killer's stare with the same eyes Grant Hartwell had deemed broken, Vera Ashton had seen as mere furniture, and Chicago had never noticed at all. When she spoke, her voice was level. To get to him, you have to go through me. The assassin lifted his gun, and in that exact second, a shot cracked through the air, not from his weapon, but from the hall behind him. Felix Valetti stood at the end of the corridor, his breathing ragged. Blood bloomed on his left shoulder from some unseen wound. Smoke still curled from his pistol. His shot had hit the killer's shoulder an instant before the man fired. The attacker went down, his gun sliding away. Felix moved forward, kicked the weapon aside, then dropped his weight on the man's back, pinning him as he spoke into his phone. "3rd floor is clear. I need backup now." Ree paid the downed man no attention. She turned back to Tommy. He was still in the corner holding his book, but his eyes had changed. He wasn't looking through her anymore. He was seeing her, and on his tear-stained, 19-year-old face was the one look Ree had spent her life searching for and had never found. It was absolute trust. She knelt by his side, set the paper knife on the floor, and pulled him into an embrace. Tommy was quiet, but his hands let the sketchbook fall as he gripped her arm like a drowning man. He began to cry, the silent, shaking sobs of a 15-year-old boy in a 19-year-old's body, releasing 4 years of locked-away grief. In this house, nobody had ever told him that tears were not a sign of weakness. Backup arrived 7 minutes later. 12 minutes after that, federal agents on Conrad's payroll appeared, took charge, and made the assassin disappear. No report was ever filed. That was just how their world worked. In the hallway, Ree and Felix sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, inches apart. Tommy was asleep in Ree's lap, breathing evenly now, his sketchbook lying near the paper knife. Felix stared ahead into nothing, the blood on his shoulder now a dark crust. Finally, he turned to her. For 2 weeks, his cold eyes had measured her, combed through her file twice, and dismissed her as a mistake waiting to happen. For the first time, all the contempt and suspicion were gone. There was only a raw, unspoken respect from a man made of violence who had just seen a barefoot woman with the paper knife prepare to die for his brother. "You could have run," Felix said, his voice a low rasp. "You had no reason to stay. This is not your family." Reese looked down at the sleeping boy in her lap, her hand gently stroking his hair. When she answered, her voice was calmer and more certain than she had ever heard it. "You're wrong, Felix. This became my family the moment I walked in this house." Felix said nothing more. He was still for a moment, then he took off his black leather jacket, the one he wore like armor, the one she'd never seen him remove, and laid it across her shoulders. In the Mafia, when a man puts his jacket on a woman, it is not a courtesy, it is a claim. It says, "She is under my protection. Hurt her, and you hurt me." Ree pulled the jacket close, the leather still warm from him. For the first time in this house, she felt she was home. Conrad took Felix's call at 12:17 in the morning in a Boston hotel room. For 3 seconds, his world stopped moving. Those 3 seconds felt longer than the 3 years he'd been told he couldn't have children, longer than the night he lay on a hospital floor with poison in his veins. Because for those 3 seconds, he had no idea if anyone in his house was still alive. Felix gave his report with the sharp economy of his trade. An attack, 4 hostels, security compromised, gate guards down. Tommy was the target. The threat was neutralized. No one dead. Backup was there. Conrad asked nothing else. He ended the call, was dressed in 40 seconds, in the garage in 2 minutes, and pushing the black Maserati out of Boston at 123 miles per hour. He was headed west on Interstate 90, straight for Chicago. A 6-hour drive. He did not stop for gas or for water. He just drove, his knuckles pale on the wheel, his eyes locked ahead. A single thought ran on a loop. If he lost one more person from that house, he would break. 4 years ago, he lost his mother. 3 years ago, he nearly lost himself. He had endured both. But on that empty highway between Boston and Chicago, Conrad admitted for the first time that this circle of protection no longer held just Felix or Tommy, Paige, or the twins. It now held Ree. The waitress he hired less than 3 weeks ago was now on the list of people for whom he would burn down a city. He didn't know when that had changed. At 6:15 in the morning, the Maserati reached the gates of the Lincoln Park estate. Conrad stepped out into the knife-sharp cold of a Chicago morning. He saw the shattered sitting room door was already covered with plywood, a clean job done overnight. There were no police cruisers, no crime scene tape, nothing to suggest that 10 hours earlier this place had been a battlefield. In Conrad Valetti's world, the signs of war were gone before sunrise. He went through the front door into a silence that was not the dead quiet Felix had described, but the warm peace of a sleeping home. The main sitting room, where glass had been broken and bullets had flown, was now lit by a low, rebuilt fire. On the long charcoal sofa, Reese was asleep, sitting up with her back to the corner and her head tilted to the side. Tommy was curled on the sofa with his head in her lap, his face calmer than Conrad had ever seen it. Paige slept at the other end on a pile of blankets, one hand clutching Tommy's shirt, as if afraid he'd disappear. Tommy's sketchbook was on the floor next to a small paper knife. Conrad stared at the knife, its presence a mystery until he heard a shift. Felix was in a chair by the foyer, a pistol in his lap, the dark rings under his eyes, proof of a long night's watch. He stood as Conrad came in, and the two brothers looked at each other in silence. Felix then gave his report, his voice low and toneless, a sterile account of the attack. He described the cameras going down, the jarring sound of breaking glass, and how Ree had reacted a split second before him. He relayed her order to get Paige to the safe room, her command for him to hold the stairs, and how she went to the third floor alone, in the dark, with no shoes. Felix stopped, and when he started again, his voice had changed. It was no longer a report. It was the sound of a man trying to explain something impossible. She stood in front of Tommy with a letter opener, Felix said, his eyes not on Conrad, but on Ree's sleeping form. The man had a silenced pistol. Her weapon was a paper knife, shorter than a finger. She had to know she would die. Do you understand? She knew that, and she didn't budge. Felix looked back at his brother, and his eyes, which had held only scorn for Ree for 2 weeks, now held a look Conrad had only ever seen him give to his blood family. She could have run, brother. She didn't have to. She was just a name on a contract, Felix swallowed. But she did not run. Conrad gave no answer. He walked past Felix into the sitting room and stopped by the sofa. He just stood there watching Ree, looking at her hand, which even in sleep rested on Tommy's hair. His eyes tracked to her bare feet, a vulnerable reminder of the previous night's violence. He registered the weight of Felix's leather jacket on her small shoulders, and deep in his chest, a wall he'd built after his mother's death, reinforced the day he was told he'd never have a son, began to splinter. Conrad sank to one knee by the couch. The sight of a dominant male kneeling was enough to stir Ree. Her eyes opened, instantly orienting to him, then her body coiled, a conditioned reflex to fight. Her gaze swept the room for threats before finally landing on his. Conrad knew that behavior, the instinctual canvassing for danger that he and Felix lived by. That Ree now performed it so naturally signaled a transformation inside her. It was not a choice but a brutal conditioning, a truth that struck him with both pride and a deep, aching pain. "You're not hurt, are you?" Conrad's voice was a flat line. His jaw, however, was a knot of iron, and his eyes were anything but calm. They were cold, predatory, hunting her form for any trace of blood or bruising, any sign she had been violated. "I'm fine," Ree said, her voice a rasp from exhaustion. Conrad gave a slow, deliberate nod, his jaw clenched tighter still, his voice dropping into a register Felix called the point of no return. A tone where Conrad never raised his voice. He lowered it until the air grew thin and people stopped breathing to hear. "You went against a gunman with a letter opener. You had no armor, you carried no weapon, you ran barefoot into the mouth of death. The anger was a firestorm, but it was aimed at himself, for his failure to be there, for the fact that she had played the part that was his alone, for a debt now owed that he could never hope to repay. Ree met his gaze without apology, without explanation, without defense. She spoke a single line, her voice so empty of feeling, so absolute, it sliced through his rage like a surgeon's blade. The pretense was over by the second week, Conrad. He could only stare. She held his gaze, and in the space between them, the psychic fortress Conrad had spent 3 years building, mortared with poison, infertility, and the dread of more loss, shattered beyond repair. Through the ruins, he no longer saw a waitress or a contract wife. He saw the woman who would die for his family with a paper knife. And a certainty that defied all logic seized him. He would never let her leave that house. Conrad turned to his brother and uttered a single command. Out! He shut the door, pulled a chair to her bedside, and did not move for 2 days. For 48 hours, the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld watched over a waitress as fever consumed her. He changed the cool cloth on her head every 20 minutes, lifted her to sip water, and counted every breath she took. He counted them just as he'd counted his mother's 4 years ago, a vigil that had ended in failure. At the second night, around 3 in the morning, the fever broke. Ree's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was Conrad. He sat gripping the mattress as if she might float away if he dared let go. Bruises of exhaustion lay beneath his eyes. 2 days of stubble shadowed his jaw. His shirt was a mess of wrinkles. The billionaire kingpin looked like any other man, terrified of losing the one thing money could not buy. Conrad, Ree breathed, her voice a faint scratch. He raised his head, and the relief that washed over his face was so intense it was nearly violent. It was the reprieve of a man pulled back from the gallows. He leaned closer, his knuckles white on the mattress. When he spoke, the command was gone from his voice. It was the voice of a man who, in the dark of a 2-night vigil, had finally admitted he could not bear to lose her. You hid that wound for 3 weeks. You almost died from a shard of glass you never mentioned. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Ree watched him, her eyes clouded but present. Angry. No, Conrad said, and the word cracked. It was a small, clean break, but Ree heard it. She was witnessing the impossible, Conrad Valetti's voice failing him. Not angry, terrified. I signed a contract for a partner. I got someone whose loss would make me burn this city to the ground. I love you, Ree, and that scares me more than any bullet ever could. The room was utterly still. Only the faint drip of the ivy and the moan of the wind filled the silence. Reese watched him for a long moment. Then with a weak and trembling hand, she reached out and traced the scar along his jawline. Her fingers moved with a slow reverence, as if reading the story etched into his skin. Conrad remained perfectly still. To everyone else, Ree whispered, her voice clear despite its softness. I am broken. A liability, something thrown away. But here with you, I want to stay. Not for the money, not for $280,000. For you. Conrad's hand covered hers, his larger one swallowing it completely as he leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. He was so close, Ree could count the flecks of silver in his beard. In that room, at 3 in the morning, the business arrangement between the barren crime lord and the desperate waitress ceased to exist. In its place grew something no contract could ever contain. After the attack, Conrad Valetti's presence in his own home began to shift. It was not one single change, but a slow tide of small movements. He began coming home before 7 o'clock. Before, he was a ghost until 10 at night, vanishing into his locked study. Now he appeared earlier. Instead of sealing himself away, he took a seat at the dinner table. He rarely spoke. He just sat, eating the food remade, listening to Paige's chatter, and watching Nina and Noah. Now and then, his gaze would land on Rhee with an intensity that Felix saw, but never questioned. It was the look of a man trying to solve the equation of how one person could change the very air in a room. The most significant change, however, concerned Tommy. One night, 2 weeks later, Conrad was walking past the third-floor art room, a hallway he'd always traversed. This time he stopped. Tommy was in his self-made world, headphones serving as a shield against reality. His brother, Conrad, broke through that fragile silence, speaking the first meaningful words between them since their mother's funeral. After a long pause that spoke of an inner battle, Tommy revealed his canvas. It showed a woman caught between shadow and light, a clear homage to a mother figure. Its meaning was undeniable. After studying it, Conrad offered a single, quiet word of praise. In return, Tommy, who had been selectively mute for 4 years, spoke a full defensive sentence. Rhee didn't leave me. The boy's reality was fixed on that one act of loyalty, a maternal protection he hadn't felt since his mother died. Conrad's reply was not in words, but in a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder, followed by a silent 20-minute vigil watching him paint. It was the most they had communicated in 4 years. 5 months after Reese's courthouse wedding, her entire public being had been rebuilt. As she entered the Palmer house, the waitress was gone, replaced by a woman no one would recognize. She wore a severe black dress, its boat neckline, and below the knee cut a uniform of stark elegance. She was unadorned except for a platinum wedding band. A ring Conrad had given her 2 months ago out of his own desire, not obligation. The black heels, a gift from Paige, had been practiced for a week in private until she moved with absolute certainty. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a hard jawline, and her eyes, once haunted, now held the cold light of Lake Michigan in the dead of winter. At her right, Conrad wore the prominent scar on his face not as a flaw, but as a statement of who he was. Felix stood at Reese's left, a silent vow that he was her sworn shield, a position he had chosen himself, a detail the onlookers did not miss. Paige walked behind them, her calm expression at 24 years old, reflecting the poise of someone raised in the art of negotiation between violent men. This was the Valetti family presenting a united front to the council for the first time in the 4 years since their mother's murder, a show of force more potent than any declaration. The meeting took place in a dark, oak-paneled room at the Palmer House, a place where prohibition bosses had once carved up the city. The ritual of trading power had never ceased, only changed its clothes. 14 men from 7 ruling families, controllers of the region's shadow empires, were in attendance. This gathering existed outside the law, unrecorded, and built entirely on fear and force. As she walked in, Reese's eyes cut through the room and found Vera Ashton. Vera sitting with the wives because her husband, Federal Judge Harrison Ashton, was a pawn in their world, was a ghost from Rhee's past. Mid-sentence, Vera's eyes found Rhee in the doorway, and the world seemed to stop. A tremor seized her hand. A champagne flute slipped, its shattering echo the only sound in the sudden hush. Vera's face was a canvas of shock, as if she were seeing a ghost returned from the grave. The woman before her was not the meek subordinate she had once dismissed as breathing furniture. Ree offered no acknowledgement, her gaze already fixed beyond this irrelevant phantom, landing on the head of the table where a flicker of tension tightened her own jaw before she willed it away. Grant Hartwell occupied a chair in the secondary row, next to the predatory stillness of a man named Antonov. Grant's suit was as pristine as the day he had branded her with the words "damaged goods." Yet time had begun to erode him. Dark circles bruised his eyes, and his jaw had a new, gaunt sharpness. When he met Ree's stare, she saw an emotion that hadn't existed 5 months ago. A toxic fusion of regret and searing envy. The sickness of a man who finally grasps the value of what he so carelessly broke. She broke contact within a second. She claimed the empty chair beside Conrad at the south end of the table, a seat of power that had been vacant for 4 years. The meeting began with the procedural dance Conrad had meticulously rehearsed with her. After the dry reports on territory and revenue, Antonov Jerkov rose to his feet. His very presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room, leaving a palpable chill. He spoke slowly, his Russian accent a deliberate, measured cadence, the sound of a hunter who knows his prey is cornered. He announced his intention to challenge the Valetti family's seat on the council. Jerkov's strategy was a pincer movement. First, he declared Conrad Valetti's lack of an heir a fatal weakness for the entire organization, portraying a bloodline without a future as a threat to them all. The second, more brutal strike was delivered by Grant Hartwell. At Jerkov's signal, Grant distributed a file to every member. In the detached monotone of a mortician, Grant detailed the contents: evidence of the Valetti family's illicit financial dealings, meticulously forged to trigger a federal investigation that would incinerate them all. The proposed solution was, in reality, a corporate execution. The council would seize all Valetti assets and place their territory under a temporary receivership controlled by Jerkov. Every gaze in the room fell upon Conrad, but Conrad ignored the files, his eyes locking onto Grant Hartwell with a focused rage. Grant recognized the look. It was the same animal terror he'd felt once when he'd wandered into a secured Valetti warehouse. Conrad's fury was a physical force, his fist clenching under the table, a prelude to violence so imminent Felix's hand moved to his weapon, just as Conrad's muscles coiled to spring, a move that would have plunged the meeting into bloodshed. A hand rested on his arm, its touch gentle but absolute. Ree's eyes were only for him. She tilted her head slightly, her voice a command meant for him alone. "Let me." For 3 suspended heartbeats the council watched, transfixed. Then the impossible occurred. Conrad leaned back, the tension draining from his shoulders as his fist uncurled. In that instant, the council witnessed a quiet revolution. Conrad Valetti, an alpha who bent for no one, had just surrendered the floor to his wife. Ree stood with a slow, deliberate grace, acutely aware that she was now the epicenter of every man's scrutiny. She moved from her seat to the middle of the long table, placing herself directly before the open file that was meant to be their doom. In a voice that was clear and unshakable, she announced, "Gentlemen of the council, I am Ree Valetti. I would like to review the documents Mr. Jerkov has provided." Anton Jerkov leaned back, a condescending smile touching his lips. It was the look of a king assessing a commoner who had wandered into his court. "This is a boardroom, Mrs. Valetti," Jerkov said, his accent stretching the name into a mockery. "Not a restaurant." The insult drew a few low, sycophantic chuckles. Grant Hartwell stared at the table, his silence a confession of his complicity. Both men were operating on a fatal assumption that the woman she was then defined the woman she was now. They were wrong. Ree let the jibe dissipate into the air. She simply extended her hand, palm up, a silent, non-negotiable demand. With a dismissive shrug, Jerkoff slid the file to her, a gesture of contempt based entirely on his certainty she was incompetent. She did not glance at the pages. She absorbed them, her focus honed by 2 years of finance studies at DePaul before her life was fractured by trauma. During the last 5 months at the Valletti estate, her nights were not for sleeping. In the solitude of a library illuminated by a single lamp, she had obsessively dissected every financial document she could find. Real estate holdings, tax shelters, wire transfers. It was not a task she was given, but a survival instinct she had embraced, a need to map every inch of her new terrain. In Conrad's world, finance was the mother tongue, and she was now fluent. After 3 minutes of utter silence, Ree finished. She set the file down, her finger marking page 17. Her gaze found Jerkoff. "Mr. Jerkoff," Ree said, her voice a flat line. "The 12 property transfers listed here are Section 1031 exchanges. This is a common tax deferral strategy, legally used by thousands of American investors every single year. It is not criminal conspiracy, it is accounting 101. A ripple of unease went through the room. Jerkoff's expression hardened. Ree continued, turning her attention to page 23. "The real crime, however, is here. A legal exchange requires supporting exhibits. In our family's original files, all exhibits are accounted for." She tapped Grant's dossier. "In the copies Mr. Hartwell provided, every single one has been deliberately removed. Not 1 or 2, all 12. This wasn't a clerical oversight, this was a calculated frame job." A tomb-like silence fell. Grant Hartwell was frozen, the color leaching from his face until his skin was a waxy gray. The first bead of sweat, a betraying signal of his terror, appeared on his temple. Ree turned to face him, and the gaze he met was not the waitress he'd written off as damaged goods, but the forensic auditor who saw the entire lie. "Furthermore," Ree added, her voice dropping, "when a banker provides client financials without a federal warrant, he commits a felony violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. The mandatory sentence begins at a $500,000 fine and 10 years in federal prison." She let the words hang in the air, then produced a folded paper from her pocket. "But the proof is this. A wire transfer confirmation from Jerkoff Holdings to a private account at Butterfield Bank in the Cayman Islands. The name on the account is Grant Arthur Hartwell. $250,000. The wire was sent 3 weeks before this meeting. Mr. Jerkoff paid Mr. Hartwell to fabricate these records to destroy the Valletti family. If the council still wants a vote of confidence, I propose we first vote on sending this evidence to the FBI." The silence in the room was now absolute. 14 powerful men sat as if turned to stone. Jerkoff slowly pressed his palms flat against the table, his face an emotionless mask, but a muscle in his jaw pulsed with rage. His eyes, for the first time, assessed Ree not with contempt, but with a cold, clinical respect. Grant Hartwell bolted upright, his chair screaming against the marble floor, his mouth open, but no sound coming out. The woman he had discarded over a $280,000 debt had just systematically executed him in front of the 14 most dangerous men in the Midwest. Wordlessly, he snatched his briefcase and fled. the door clicking shut behind him like a cell door locking. Across the table, Felix Valetti, who had once called Ree a liability, leaned forward. His voice carried across the room. Let me make this simple for anyone who is still confused. This is my sister-in-law. If you want to touch her, you have to go through me first. Then Conrad stood. A man of few words, his actions were his statement. He put a hand on Ree's waist and pulled her to his side, facing the council as a united front. His gray-blue eyes met Jerkoff's, not with heat, but with a far more lethal coldness, absolute ownership. She is my wife. She is Valetti. Does anyone else want to test that theory? No one did. The motion to vote was dead. Jerkoff left 10 minutes later without another word, and Ree Calloway, the woman once dismissed as damaged goods, walked out of the Palmer House Hotel into the March sun. Flanked by Conrad, Felix, and Paige, her story already hardening into legend in Chicago's underworld. In the following months, the Valetti family didn't just stabilize. It began an era of growth unseen in a decade. Ree joined Conrad's council not as his wife, but as a strategic weapon, rebuilding their financial models with an accountant's precision and the ferocity of a woman who had nothing left to fear. Her proposition made even Conrad pause. A methodical cleansing of their finances, shifting assets from the shadows of quasi-legal enterprises into legitimate portfolios and acquiring properties through sanitized shell corporations. This was not a moral crusade, but a tactical repositioning, moving the Valetti name from darkness into the light. A legitimate empire offered no foothold for federal agents or council interference. After a week of charged silence, Conrad gave his two-word assent. Do it! It was all the authority she needed. By June, for the first time in the family's history, clean real estate profits surpassed their illicit earnings. That July, Conrad claimed territory in southern Indiana without spilling a drop of blood. Legitimate capital had become a more persuasive weapon than intimidation. The most radical change, however, was in Felix. The eternal outsider was now an insider, a fixture sharing morning coffee with Ree at the kitchen table. Their conversations were clipped, the functional shorthand of people who saw no use for wasted words. He began to seek her opinion, first on security, then on men, and finally on grand strategy. When an underling challenged Ree in a June meeting, Felix ended the dissent in 45 seconds with a chilling finality that was never spoken of, yet never forgotten. He was no longer just Conrad's weapon. He was the guardian of the new Valetti family, and Ree was now its core. Paige, in early June, sent her application to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for fashion design. It was a 3-year-old dream she had smothered, as the family's world since her mother's death had been measured in survival, not ambition. It was Ree who found the sketchbook Paige kept hidden, who gave her dream legitimacy with the words, "You have a rare gift." It was Ree who wrote the tuition check from an account Conrad established for her. Money she never touched, for a life of having nothing, had left her with no idea how to spend on herself. But she knew how to invest in Paige. Tommy's progress was a quiet miracle. He remained mostly silent, a ghost in the third-floor art room, but his canvases began to change. In the months before Ree, his paintings were a storm of dark hues and solitary blurred shapes. His art became the family's emotional barometer. Muted canvases now bled with chromatic life, the warm yellow of the kitchen lights, the soft red glow from the fireplace, the pale blue of a Chicago sky framed by his window. Crucially, he started painting people, abandoning the abstract smudges of his past. Paige laughing, Felix with his coffee, Nina and Noah arguing on the couch. And at the heart of nearly every scene was Ree, the anchor. His retreat from the world lessened. He joined them for meals, first 3 times a week, then 5, then every day. Words followed, brief but present, each sentence a brick, rebuilding a psyche shattered by trauma. The 16-year-old twins, Na and Noah, once hostile, now jockeyed for the space next to her on the sofa. And Na, the girl whose words were her sharpest daggers, moved from calling Ree nothing to her name, and finally to the single word that remade their world: sister. That small change in title carried more weight than any treaty signed downtown. A fragile peace settled over the house, an equilibrium that lasted until August. It was broken by a scent. Ree, who had run on espresso since she was 18, the fuel of her survival, developed a sudden, violent revulsion to it. The aroma of coffee, once a promise of stability, became an assault. One morning, as Margaret Byrne brewed a pot, the scent sent a wave of nausea through Ree so powerful she had to flee to the bathroom and retch. At first, she blamed exhaustion from the 14-hour days spent sanitizing ledgers. She tried remedies, more water, a different diet, but the sickness clung to her. On the 3rd day, the nausea returned. On the 5th, the room spun when she stood. By the 7th, the ordinary smell of roasting meat drove her to the balcony for 10 minutes, gasping for air. A dormant fear stirred, a cold, familiar dread, known only to a child who has watched a parent die from a creeping illness. Her mind spiraled into dark speculation about the attack, the glass in her foot, the infection she'd hidden for 3 weeks. She wondered if she'd been hit with a slow-acting poison. She hid it, a reflexive instinct honed over 27 years of solitude. Her first response to any wound was to conceal the vulnerability. But Conrad Velzy was a man who saw everything. He noted the absence of her morning coffee. He marked her new distance from the grill. He saw the subtle narrowing of her eyes when she stood up, a micro-expression of a body fighting dizziness. He saw these things because for 5 months he had studied her, memorizing every line and shadow of her face until he could distinguish a true smile from a mask. And that day, she was wearing a mask. One evening in August, Conrad stood framed in the kitchen doorway watching Ree at the sink. He never took the long way around. "What are you hiding from me?" Ree froze, her hands still under the running water. "Nothing." "The last time it was nothing, you were dying of sepsis. I will not ask you a 3rd time, Ree." Silence. She turned off the water, set down a plate, and faced him. In her eyes, Conrad saw an emotion he had almost never seen there: terror. "I'm sick every morning. The smell of coffee makes me retch. I'm dizzy. I don't know what it is, but it's how it started with my mother." Conrad closed the distance between them, his hands gripping her shoulders. His eyes were cold, sharp steel, a look she recognized not as anger but as fear, the kind of fear a king shows to no one but his queen. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, Northwestern Memorial, Dr. Helen Ross, obstetrics and endocrinology, the city's best. Not Stanton, not the family doctor, the best." Ree began to question what obstetrics had to do with anything, but she was too tired to fight. When Conrad Valetti used that tone, even she knew not to disobey. At 7:12 in the morning, on the 4th floor of Northwestern Memorial, Dr. Helen Ross's office overlooked Lake Michigan. Ree sat on the examination table, her hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the gray-blue horizon as she tried to calm the frantic beating of her heart. To her right, Conrad sat perfectly still, his posture ramrod straight. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the arms of the chair, Ree knew that beneath the iron control he was afraid. She knew because in 8 months she had learned to read the quiet tells of this complicated man. And she knew Conrad Valetti only clenched his fists like that when bracing for a fatal blow. Dr. Helen Ross came in, carrying results. At 52, with cropped salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes, she had the air of a woman with 30 years of experience, who was impressed by no one, not even a kingpin. She sat, glanced at the file, then met their gazes with an expression Ree couldn't place. It wasn't concern, but it wasn't clinical detachment either. It was the look of a person about to change the world. "Mrs. Vallet, doctor," Ross began, her tone professional. "Before we discuss these results, I have a question for your husband." She turned to Conrad. "Mr. Valetti, who told you that you were permanently infertile?" The scar on Conrad's jaw tightened. "Dr. Philip Stanton, our family physician. 3 years ago, after I was poisoned, the tests confirmed permanent damage." Dr. Ross nodded, setting her pen down. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, each word deliberate. "Mr. Valetti, I have reviewed your entire medical file from that incident 3 years ago. That poison, I suspect it was an industrial chemical, did catastrophic damage to your reproductive system. At the time, Dr. Stanton's diagnosis was not incorrect." She let that last word hang in the air, and Ree stopped breathing. But the body's ability to heal is profound, especially when its environment improves. Better nutrition, lower stress, stability. These things can repair what was once considered irreparable. The diagnosis 3 years ago was accurate for that moment in time, but it was not a life sentence. Conrad did not so much as flinch. He sat perfectly still, his gaze locked on the doctor. Ree saw his fingers dig into the leather, wrinkling it. He was holding himself together, waiting for the impact, because for the last 3 years, the word "but" had always preceded tragedy. Dr. Ross turned back to Ree, a slight smile touching her lips. "Mrs. Valetti, you are in perfect health. Your symptoms are not from poison or any illness. You're pregnant, approximately 11 weeks." The room dissolved. The view of Lake Michigan dissolved. The sterile lights, the chemical scent, the hum of hospital equipment. It all faded into nothing. Her world contracted to a single phrase that echoed in the silence between them. Pregnant, 11 weeks. For 5 heartbeats, Ree was utterly still. Then her hand splayed across her stomach, pressing against the firmness she now realized was not sickness, but new life. "But," Ree breathed, her voice a tremor as her vision blurred, "they told me he couldn't. For 3 years, the specialist called it permanent." "How?" A knowing smile touched Dr. Ross's lips. "I have been a physician for 30 years, Mrs. Valetti. If I have learned anything, it is to never call something permanent in the human body, especially when a person has a powerful will to heal." Her gaze drifted to Conrad, still motionless in his chair, then met Ree's again. "I will give you two a private moment." She rose, took the file, and slipped from the office, the door clicking softly behind her. A heavy, clinical quiet descended. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic hiss of the blood pressure cuff and the breathing of 2 people. Ree watched Conrad. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on some unseen point across the room. She studied the features of the man Chicago had branded a monster, the man who commanded a billion-dollar enterprise with pure force. She had seen this man absorb every kind of worldly assault without the slightest reaction. Now she witnessed something she had never seen before. He was shattering, not from physical pain, but from a reality his mind refused to accept. Conrad didn't rise. He slid from the chair in a slow-motion collapse, as if his bones had turned to dust. Both knees struck the cold linoleum floor. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Rhee's abdomen. His large, scarred, calloused hands circled her waist, his face hidden in the fabric of her shirt. And then his shoulders began to heave. No sound came from him. Conrad Valetti had lost the ability to cry out loud. An instinct snuffed out the night his mother died on their living room floor 4 years ago, but his body was grieving for him now. His shoulders shuddered in great violent waves like a dam giving way under immense pressure. Through those cracks, 3 years of profound psychological shame erupted. 3 years of being branded to dead end in his own bloodline. 3 years of hearing rivals whisper that his reign had an expiration date. 3 years of sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, contemplating the nothingness that would follow when everything he built died with him. All of it was released at once on the floor of a 4th-floor examination room at Northwestern Memorial. His forehead rested on his wife's stomach, where a tiny new heart was beating 160 times a minute, a heart that consensus had declared an impossibility. Rhee buried both hands in his hair. Her fingers tightened, holding him fast as her own tears traced paths down her cheeks. But she was smiling, a trembling, tear-streaked, brilliant expression of someone stepping out of a long darkness into a sudden, blinding light. "Can you feel that, Conrad?" Rhee whispered, her voice breaking, but every word clear. "Can you feel it? We're going to have a baby." On the cold floor of that sterile room, the most feared man in Chicago clung to his wife's middle and wept like a man relearning a fundamental piece of his own humanity. And the waitress the world had written off as damaged goods just held him, stroking his hair, knowing she was never broken, never ruined, never barren ground, because the impossible thing was growing inside her, day by day, silent, patient, and fierce, exactly like its mother. In the spring that followed, a year later, when the cherry trees along Lake Michigan bloomed in a haze of white and the Chicago air carried warmth instead of cold for the first time in 6 months, Rhee gave birth to a healthy baby boy at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. It was the same building where, half a year before, she sat on an examination table and heard the 3 words that changed everything. The infant weighed 3.4 kilograms, cried with vigor, and was in perfect condition. When the doctor laid him on Rhee's chest for the very first time, she looked down at the tiny, red, indignant face, and she wept. Not from the pain or exhaustion, but because she was looking at living, breathing proof that every terrible judgment the world had ever passed on her was wrong. They named him James Calloway Valetti. His middle name came from Rhee's own family name, from her father, the steel worker from Rockford, who died in an industrial accident when she was 11, with no insurance, no payout, and no proof he ever existed beyond his daughter's memories. Now, that name was on the birth certificate of the heir to the Valetti empire. Rhee imagined that somewhere her father was smiling. Conrad stood beside the hospital bed for the entire 6-hour labor, his hand locked with hers. And when their son let out his first cry, the most brutal mafia boss in Chicago bowed his head and kissed his wife's forehead, unable to form a single word as emotion closed his throat. It was the second time in Rhee's life she had ever seen him cry, and she decided then that it would be the last time any outside force would ever make this man shed tears of pain. From now on, if he cried, it would only be from joy. 2 weeks later, the Lincoln Park mansion had transformed. If any of the family's senior capos saw it, they would not have believed their eyes. Felix Valetti, 28 years old, the family's second in command, a man whose underlings trembled in his presence. He sat to the living room couch, holding the newborn with such an exaggerated, comical precision, his elbows bent at a perfect 90-degree angle and his spine ramrod straight, as if he were disarming a bomb. His face was tighter with concentration than it ever was facing down an enemy. With every tiny stir from James, Felix would shoot a look of pure panic at Rhee, as if the 3.4-kilogram infant was the single greatest threat he had ever faced. Tommy was in the corner of the room by his easel. On the canvas was a portrait of James sleeping, the most technically skilled and emotionally powerful piece Tommy had ever created. It was not because the technique was flawless, but because for the first time in 4 years, Tommy's art had no darkness, no shadows, no isolated figures. There was only light. The warm golden glow from the kitchen lamps fell across the sleeping baby's face. When he was done, he carried the painting over and set it before Rhee, saying in a quiet, solid voice, "This is for you. It's the first painting I've ever made that I actually love." And Noah fought so often for his turn to hold James that Margaret Byrne had to create a schedule like a hospital's shift change. Noah got 30 minutes, then the next person got 30, and the 16-year-old twins, the ones who used to hide Rhee's shoes and call her dollar store trash, now called her Sister Rhee and spoke of James as "our baby," with the complete innocent ownership of teenagers. Paige gave James his first outfit, which she had sewn herself, stitch by stitch, from soft white cotton with baby blue trim. It was the very first piece made by a first-year fashion design student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And when Rhee dressed James in it, Paige wept, not from sadness, but because the last time she'd seen a baby in a handmade outfit in this house was when her own mother was still alive. And now, finally, that painful memory felt complete. That night, after the house grew quiet, Rhee sat in the cognac leather armchair Conrad had made for her by the fireplace. James was asleep on her chest, his tiny, even breaths a warmth against her shirt. The fire crackled softly. Conrad stood by the window, his back leaned against the oak frame, looking into the room. His gaze wasn't on the world outside, but on the world within. He watched Rhee and James in the chair. He saw Tommy's painting hanging on the wall. He saw Paige's hand-sewn outfit draped over a chair back. He saw Felix's forgotten cold cup of coffee on a side table, right next to the handgun he'd left there, because for the first time in his life, he had forgotten he was carrying it. His gaze settled on the sneakers Nana and Noah had kicked into a jumble. Their rush to greet the baby, leaving footwear forgotten at the threshold. He absorbed it all. Each small, chaotic, flawed, and resonant signal of life. And he knew that this very state of being, was what he had believed 3 years ago was forever beyond his reach. Not an empire, not dominion, not wealth, but a home defined by abandoned shoes and the air's strange alchemy of infant formula, oil paint, and cold coffee. A family. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She was Rhee Valetti, mother to James, the gravitational center of the Valetti Six, the quiet queen of their empire, the woman who had walked into this house with worn-out shoes and a hollowed soul and made it a sanctuary. Not with money, not with force, but with the one thing no one could ever purchase or conquer, a spirit that refused to break. And in the shadowed heart of the estate's ground floor study sealed within a 300-kilogram steel vault to which Conrad alone held the key, rested a fragile artifact. It lay beside 3 handguns, 2 forged passports, and $750,000 of escape currency. A small, folded slip of yellowing paper. It was the bill from Serafina, from an October night a year gone. The first time Conrad Valadi stepped inside those doors and saw a waitress who held her ground in a room full of wolves. On the reverse, penned in Conrad's severe, right-slanting script, was a single, stark observation. She did not break. I have found her. The story of Rhea and Conrad was never a fairy tale. The subject's file contained no myths, no prophesied saviors, no storybook conclusions. It was a history forged by the brutal realities of existence, by debt, by violence, by trauma to the flesh, and by institutional abandonment. Yet it held what legends lack: cold, hard data. And this data confirmed a fundamental shift in perception, that a human's value is not measured by capital, by bloodline, or by the second-hand judgment of others. Value was instead found in the will to rebuild from absolute collapse, in the compassion shown to the powerless, and in the capacity to love despite a lifetime of conditioning to feel unworthy. The subject, Reese, entered the engagement in $12 shoes and emerged the master of an enterprise. Yet the ultimate acquisition was not power, nor was it money. It was the validation of a grim hypothesis: that relentless defiance against overwhelming pressure will, given time, force destiny to kneel. If this profile has triggered a profound response in you, log it. Share this file with your network and subscribe for continued analysis. We are assembling a chronicle of data, charting how this subject's experience echoes your own cycles of collapse and recovery. Record your own account below. Every piece of testimony is cataloged and analyzed for its patterns. We recognize that the apex of human function is found in health, in emotional balance, and in peace. We thank you for your focus. This session is now terminated. Await the next signal.
From a deeper perspective, Reese and Conrad are not simply 2 damaged people who fall in love. They are 2 symbols trapped inside systems that measure human worth in cruel, mechanical ways. Reese is judged through debt, social class, and usefulness. Conrad is judged through bloodline, fertility, and succession. Both are told in different languages that they are incomplete. That is why their story resonates beyond Mafia drama. Conrad believes he needs a wife to preserve power, but what he truly needs is someone capable of restoring humanity to a house that has become emotionally unlivable. Reese does not enter the Valletti family as a queen. She enters as a witness. She sees grief where others see weakness. She sees silence where others see obedience. She sees a family not ruled by strength, but paralyzed by unresolved pain. The brilliance of her role is that she changes the emotional climate before she changes the political outcome. Long before Palmer House, long before the pregnancy, Reese is already transforming legacy. She teaches the family how to gather, how to trust, how to exist in the same room without armor. In that sense, she becomes more than a wife. She becomes a counterforce against inherited violence. And that is the lesson this story leaves behind. Legacy is not born the day a child arrives. Legacy begins the moment someone changes the emotional future of the people around them. Reese does that first. The child only confirms what her presence had already made true.